Hello everyone, Shirley here, and welcome to my updated patch 11.1 Arms Warrior Guide. I'm going to be going over a little bit of everything today, from gear to stats, talents, specs, and of course rotation. So before we jump in here, if you're new to the channel and you want a little bit of background on me, I've been rating Cutting Edge on my Arms Warrior specifically since in Taurus, every single tier, and consistently doing pretty well. So, without further ado, jumping in, we're going to take a look at gear and stats right off the bat here. There'll be timestamps for all this stuff down below if you just want to skip ahead to the rotation section, of course. First thing, going over our tier set for this tier, it's the winning streak, our 2 and 4 set. Your abilities have a chance to begin a winning streak, increasing the damage of your overpower by 5%, stacking up to 10 times, and every time you press it, overpower has 15% chance to end your winning streak. And the 4 set is when it ends, you gain 2% haste and 2% mortal strike and cleave damage per stack for 12 seconds. This tier set is actually really good and mostly passive, this tier, so you don't really have to think about it too much. You just play your warrior normally with your rotation, and this will passively benefit you. It is worth noting, however, if you get really lucky, because the whole thing is themed on gambling, but if you get really lucky and proc the end of the winning streak again while it's already running, you can actually extend the duration of it. That doesn't actually impact your gameplay, but it can happen, and it's a nice little bonus. So, other than that, our stat line is going to be crit, haste, mastery, versatility. Pretty much in that order is what you want to focus on. Now, that being said, you can see that my crit is actually lower than my haste and mastery at the moment. That's for a couple of reasons. Obviously, you're going to want to sim your own gear at the end of the day, but one of the things that's inflating this is, like, I have this trinket that's giving me a ton of crit rating. We're also speccing into recklessness these days for one of our talents, which gives us more crit rating. But basically, you're going to hit a pseudo breakpoint around 25%-ish, 25 to 30%, where you'll want to put more into haste eventually. And then once you hit those two numbers, around that number to 30, mastery is going to get more and more valuable. And then finally, versatility. Versatility is not bad to have. It's just going to be, taking a back seat up until the 30% diminishing returns, basically, and then this is going to fill out. Speaking of which, for other pieces of gear of relevance, the crafted pieces I'm using at the moment are the weapon, once again, that I was using last tier that gives us the Nerubian Ascendance proc, and the bracers, or, you could put this on the cloak or whatever, that doubles the embellishment effect of this. Now, eventually, you're probably going to want to replace these, but early on in progression, if you don't get, like, a mythic weapon out the gate, or if you're new to the class, then crafting this is, totally fine and would recommend. But eventually, you're probably going to want to swap to a couple of pieces that have the crit embellishment on it, that I'm mousing over here in the corner, that I've got saved up, and I'm going to upgrade these much later and swap those out for a proper mythic weapon for the extra 3 item level over the crafted piece. Other than that, rings, one thing to note is I've got the Gallywix ring. This thing is insane. But most people are probably going to be running the Circe's Circlet ring from the Siren Island still. And those are the gems I'm using in mine, or was using in mine, if you want to read that. I have since swapped out to these two because this ring is insane, and anything with just a big stat stick of crit haste on it is going to be valuable in your other slot. Speaking of which, crit haste is what I'm slapping on anything that I'm crafting as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it for stats. Moving on to other things now. Oh, before I skip to talents, our consumables haven't changed. We're going to be using the Flask of Alchemical Chaos, the Algari Mana Oil, Tempered Potions, and then either the Big Feast if you're in a raid, or just Belladar's Bounty is fine for personal food if you're running Mythic Plus or any kind of dungeons like that. Alright, moving on to talents. This is going to be my recommended standard single target build, basically. In the past, I was showing Slayer and Colossus, but I'm going to trim things down this time around and just keep it. We're going to be playing Slayer for single targets, raid, and Colossus for AOE and Mythic Plus. And you can, mix those around and play what you want, but this is what I'm going to focus on for today. I'm not going to go over every single talent in the tree, you can read it, but I will point out things that are relevant and important to consider when you're speccing things out, because there are things you can always move around a little bit with some wiggle room. For example, starting off here, Thunderclap, I'm going to be grabbing this. A lot of people would go down through Shockwave to grab the extra stun, but in Raid, I like to have Thunderclap for a little bit of ranged to apply your rend to multiple targets or even the boss if it's just getting out of your melee range, if you have to move for a mechanic, for example. I'm also grabbing Stormbolt. You could, forego this and go down the Shockwave route if you want. Stormbolt's just like a minuscule amount of damage that you can min-max if you want, but it's not that big of a deal. Other talents, Spell Reflect, you should always be grabbing this. It's an amazing defensive, not just for reflecting, but the magic damage mitigation is very valuable. And then moving our way down the tree, we're going back into Barbaric Training over Sidearm from like last tier, the way things have changed. And real quick, Arm's got a slight rebalance this tier, so there's way less emphasis on our bleed damage and more emphasis just on Mortal Strike, Cleave, and Execute, and Overpower, doing the majority of our DPS now. And that is reflected in our capstones on the warrior side of the tree. All of our capstone talents aren't that strong by themselves. We are grabbing Warlord's Torment for the Recklessness activation, but otherwise we're just grabbing Thunderous Roar and Avatar here, and then we're filling out all of these stat nodes, which isn't very exciting, but this happens to be the best setup right now for single targets. Grabbing all this stuff, as well as the Recklessness passive, which mostly I would say is for the crit rate, that gives you 20% extra crit for this window, rather than the Rage Generation. The Rage Generation's nice, but the crit window is really what makes it valuable, in my opinion. Alright, moving over to the arm side of the tree here. Looking at things since the rebalance, we are dropping Skull Splitter. I'm a fan of this personally. I never liked this button. We're taking 1 point out of Bloodborne since this got nerfed. Speaking of the bleed nerf, Thunderous Words got nerfed as well, which is another reason why we're not investing so heavily into bleed damage right now. We're picking up Strength of Arms for more overpower damage. We only have 1 point in Deft Experience just for the Mastery and mostly the Tactician chance to reset. We are still grabbing 1 into Bloodletting because this is just a really powerful talent on its own, especially since it's going to allow you to apply Rend with Mortal Strike below 35%. And now a ton of our power is going to be back and unhinged again, with Slayer at least, and Colossus to a certain extent. We're still grabbing Blunt Instruments and In for the Kill, still not speccing in a Test of Might. Maybe that'll change by the end of the expansion, but Test of Might is just really solid all around, so we're going into that now. We are picking up Exhilarating Blows, which is going to kind of change up the rotation a bit, especially in AOE. Giving Mortal Strike and Cleave a 20% chance to instantly reset their cooldowns. And then other than that, we're taking all the Execute talents to stack up Juggernaut and do, big funnel there. And then briefly looking at the Slayer tree, we are taking Brutal Finish. Culling Cyclone just doesn't do much. Brutal Finish is just, leaning into Mortal Strike's damage more and more. And then this one, Fierce Fall Through is a bit too RNG, even though we take a lot of crit. Whereas Opportunist is very consistent, and it's a ton of throughput damage, so I'm always going to be taking this. And it also impacts our rotation as a Slayer Arms Warrior. Speaking of which, let's jump right into the rotation here on this target dummy. Starting with single targets, I'm going to go over the priority and then demonstrate it here real quick, and then we'll talk about the execute phase as well as anytime there's cleave. So right off the bat, Arms has a priority system, basically. You're going to generally want to be pressing Mortal Strike on cooldown, keeping Rend active all the time, using your cooldowns when they're appropriate or they're active, being Colossus Smash, Thunderous Roar, and Avatar, and Bladestorm, and then filling out with Overpower, and last but not least, Slam. Ignoring Execute for the moment. Using Sudden Death procs, though, during the phase. So what that looks like in practice is this right here, the Opportunist buff, basically is going to take priority over everything. You're going to be hitting Overpower when it procs over Mortal Strike in most cases. Otherwise, it's just Mortal Striking on cooldown, and if you don't get procs. So, jumping right in here on the pull, what I'm going to do is charge in, of course, get Rend up on the targets, Thunderous Roar is going to be our first major, global cooldown here. And then I'm going to wait the GCD, as it spins around before I activate my avatar, because it's off global cooldown. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to line it up right with Colossus Smash, and that's to get the most value out of Warlord's Torment, because you only have a 6-second window of Recklessness. And I don't want people to just macro Roar and Avatar together, because they share the same 1.5 minute cooldown. Basically, you want these to be offset by like a second, just to buy you that extra little bit of rec time. So, starting over, we're going to Rend, Roar, Avatar into Colossus Smash, and then I'm going to Mortal Strike into my Bladestorm, because we want to get that rolling on cooldown, and Mortal Strike is so much of our damage profile now. We're going to immediately hit that into our Bladestorm, and then coming out of the Bladestorm, you can either just Mortal Strike again, because it's going to be up, or I like to throw in an Overpower right off the bat to get these charges rolling into my first Mortal Strike, just so that that cooldown is potentially running for Tactician resets. And the only thing that can throw a wrench in this is if you get a sudden death proc on the pull. So if I get a sudden death proc on the pull when I'm pressing all my buttons before Bladestorm, I'm going to go ahead and use it, because it's going to accelerate your Bladestorm to hit at an additional time, which is going to give you another unhinged proc, so just a bigger burst on your opener, and it's going to start your Juggernaut stacks going. And Juggernaut stacks is something that you definitely want to be tracking and keeping an eye on as a Slayer warrior, because it's going to directly feed into how much damage you can do. Speaking of which, the way that Juggernaut is going to work is we have 3 things we're going to be paying attention to during the fight. Anytime you get 2 stacks of Juggernaut, you want to spend one of them immediately, because it can stack twice. We don't want to overcap on that. Also, anytime you get 3 of these marked for execution stacks from our Slayer passive from this, we want to use up our sudden death procs. We're not overcapping on 3. And last but not least, anytime Juggernaut is about to fall off, we want to execute, so that buff is maintained as long as possible. And if you get lucky throughout a fight, you can stack this all the way up to 15 times without actually being an execute phase. That's pretty rare, but it can stack up to 7 or 8 fairly consistently. So that's a lot of damage on the table that you would otherwise be losing if you're just pressing sudden death as soon as it procs every single time. Alright, so that all being said, let's go ahead and show this off here real quick. We're going to charge in, put up our Rend, Roar into our cooldowns, Mortal Strike. We got a sudden death right there, so I'm going to use that into my first Bladestorm. You can Stormbolt during your Bladestorm if you want, just for a little extra damage. I'm going to Overpower out into my Mortal Strike, using up those charges, using the Opportunist procs every time they come up. Being sure to maintain my Rend. There's another proc, and now I have this little weak aura here that I'm going to share with you guys that's going to allow me to track my sudden death things. And last but not least, you would just fill out with Slam there. So that little weak aura that popped up, that I'll link this right here, this just tells you if one of those 3 criteria that I mentioned earlier are met. Being, is Juggernaut going to fall off? Do you have 2 stacks of sudden death? Or do you have 3 marked for executions on the target? And that'll light up and just tell you to press execute, so you don't got to think about it, and you don't need to manually track those 3 things. It'll just light up and tell you to press it. Yeah, and that's pretty much the general rotation for Slayer single target at the moment. Now, going over the execute phase very briefly here, it's pretty much the same thing, except you're cutting out Slam, and it's a bit more rage management now with Overpower and Execute. So basically, we're going to use our cooldowns as they come up, of course, being the 3 major ones. But other than just Bladestorming on cooldown, we want to make sure that we have 2 Executioner's Precisions on the target before we Bladestorm, because Bladestorm is going to automatically cast our Mortal Strikes. Basically, it's going to go 2 Executes into Mortal Strike and repeat that. However, anytime Opportunist procs and you have less than 80 rage, go ahead and use your Overpower. Or anytime you're just rage starve, if you're not getting lucky with auto attack crits or anything like that, you want to weave in your Overpowers in between just spending rage. So in reality, it's going to look like 2 Executes and Overpower, Mortal Strike. 2 Executes, Overpower, Mortal Strike. And just keep repeating that flow, and it'll be a very smooth, rotation. That being said, at like the very start of the execute phase, and you're like Colossus smashing, and you've got a big haste buff from in for the kill, you might consider, if you're flooded with rage, just spamming like 3 executes into Mortal Strike, 3 executes into Mortal Strike, just to get your Juggernaut stacks up to 15 as fast as possible, and then you can start worrying about the rage economy and weaving in more overpowers. So, watching that right here, I'm going to go ahead and just use cooldowns to get this thing back down into execute rage to show this off here real quick. And our standard single target right here, got a proc, you love to see it. Spin this down. Using our Mortal Strike out, just about got it in execute range. There we go. So execute range, 2 stacks, Mortal Strike. Got an overpower proc. I've got mid-rage, so I'm going to use that into our Mortal Strike. A little bit low rage, I'm going to weave in an overpower too. Still no proc, so this can happen. Got another sudden death, that's nice. Throwing in our Colossus. Opportunist, another Opportunist. 2 more executes, and now we got Bladestorm back, so we can go ahead and instantly use that, eating those 2 Executioner Precision buffs right there. And now we're into like a standard kind of flow where you want to keep throwing in an overpower whenever you especially get those Opportunist procs, just to keep your rage bar, you know, healthy throughout the execute phase. And that's how it looks. Alright, very long-winded explanation for single target rotation. Very briefly on the Slayer front, if there's ever any adds or anything you need to cleave, if you want to swap out any talents, in the raid right now, there's very few situations where you're going to make drastic changes to your tree. What I would recommend, though, is if there's a lot of spread adds or light cleave on everything, you can drop this talent, add a Bloodborne, and grab Cleave, and that's going to prop up just your spread pressure. But in a more realistic situation, it's a lot of 2-target cleave, where we're just prioritizing sweeping executes and Mortal Strikes, in which case I would drop Bloodborne and grab improved sweeping strikes. And this I'm using on a lot of the bosses in the raid, actually. It's a pretty good drop, because 5% of your bleed damage is not that big of a deal to drop that. And just real quick, an example would be like Cauldron, I'm going to grab improved sweeping strikes. Styx, you could go cleave if you wanted to, or improved sweeping strikes. Bandit, improved sweeping strikes. Gallywix, improved sweeping strikes, etc. Anyway, moving on now to the Cleave spec. We're just going to go straight into Colossus for this one, since this video is going to be super long as it is. This is the Mythic Plus build that I'm going to recommend, outside of swapping around a couple of things, perhaps. One being, you could grab Rumbling Earth if your group needs some extra CC and faster shockwaves. This is a good talent to grab. And this also, most of the time, you might want Warlord's Torment. This is going to be better boss damage and just big demolish crit windows. Or you can play Blade Master's Torment. They're fairly interchangeable, but this one's going to lean more into our AOE profile rather than boss damage, and it's just kind of fun to use. So I'm going to be showing off what it's like with Blade Master's Torment at the moment, which, when you activate Avatar, gives you 8 seconds of sweeping strikes and reduces the cooldown of Cleave by 1.5 seconds. And this allows us to cleave every other global, basically. And also, the sweeping strikes that's activated off of Avatar will stack with your normal sweeping strikes, which means that you get extra duration on your normal sweeping strikes, which allows to funnel this talent, Collateral Damage, which will make your cleave after sweeping strikes do increased damage depending on the number of abilities you hit. And in a dungeon, you can kind of repeatedly set up yourself to get really big cleave burst windows off of this talent, and this just helps prop it up every 1.5 minutes for even more damage. Other than that, we're dropping a couple of points in Cruel Strikes to pick up some extra bleed talents. Big deal is Thunderous Roar's cooldown getting reduced, so we'll have this up for basically every pack in a dungeon. More pressure that way. On the Colossus side of things, we're grabbing the Cleave Damage talents, obviously, instead of the Bleed one. This one, for the Shockwave buff, is kind of a preference. I prefer the extra second, personally, but the other one's fine too for the reduced cooldown. And then on the Warrior side of things, we are not taking anything in Bloodborne. We are instead grabbing Battle Lord here, which is a big deal for Colossus, getting more Mortal Strike resets in to help funnel our Demolish, because Demolish is going to be a ton of the damage profile for this. Speaking of that, we're also grabbing Warbreaker just for bigger burst on AOE. Still grabbing Unhinged, but now with Ravager for Colossus, as well as Merciless Bone Grinder just for extra cleave damage during our big Ravager windows. Still grabbing Exhilarating Blows. This definitely adds some RNG to the rotation because potentially you can just cleave like 5 times in a row during any kind of AoE with this. Not grabbing Massacre. You could swap this for some things if you wanted. I'm just grabbing Sharpen and Executioner's Precision for a bit of extra execute pressure. Grabbing Fervor of Battle here. This is going to add up a lot over time since you're going to be cleaving constantly. Slam, does some decent damage, especially with this talent. And we're grabbing Seismic to help buff cleave as well. So, going over this, what it looks like in a rotation. Let's go downstairs here to some AoE target dummies real quick. It's once again going to be a priority system, but it's slightly simpler actually than Slayer because we don't have to worry about Opportunist. So Mortal Strike just takes front and center for Colossus now. As long as you have the rage for it, you should be Mortal Striking on cooldown rather than hitting Overpower every single time it procs, is what I would recommend. But basically, we're going to go in and apply our Ren to these 5 targets with Thunderclap this time around. Well, you could actually open up with Cleave and get up deep wounds on everything first, and also this is going to give you a stack of Colossal Might, which is very important for big burst windows with Demolish. So yeah, we're going to go in, cleave all these guys, and then Thunderclap to get rend up on everything. And then how our opener is going to look for a burst window is I'm going to Thunderous Roar out of that, and then Sweeping Strikes, and this is a half a global cooldown. It's a faster global than every other spell we have, so you have to be very fast on this if you're doing it this way. But I'm going to Roar into Sweep, and then as soon as that comes back around, I'm going to Avatar and hit my Ravager at the same time. And that's just to buy that extra little window. Well, if you're using Warlord's Torment, that's to buy an extra window off the Wreck Bomb. But it works the same way with Blade Master's Torment. Hit these 2 things, and then I'm going to Warbreaker, and then immediately cleave. And basically the rule of thumb is if there's 3+ targets, you're going to cleave over Mortal Strike. But we're going to cleave, and if it procs, you can do it again and keep doing it again. Otherwise, with Sweep Up, we're going to cleave into our Mortal Strike, and then cleave, and rinse repeat until we have 10 stacks of Colossal Might, and that hopefully will still be during our cooldown window, and then we're going to immediately Demolish with that Sweeping Strikes up into, a big burst, into our big cleave, and just keep rinse repeating that. And then at the end of the pack, what's going to happen is when Sweeping Strikes finally falls off, you're going to get this big collateral damage buff with a few seconds to spare, usually on like Warbreaker, maybe Demolish, depending on how lucky you are with crits. And you can set up like going into the next group of things with that buff still active because it lasts quite some time. So you can go into the next pack and instantly Warbreaker into a Demolish potentially to get that extra 10% damage that we're getting off of Demolish into that big collateral damage cleave. So all that being said, we're going to go ahead and show this off. Going in, we're going to cleave, put up our Rens into our cooldown window here. I just did that backwards. Ignoring that, we're going to cleave and get up our stacks. There it is, into our Demolish. Cleave, Mortal Strike, cleave, got a proc, didn't get a proc, latency, thank you. Cleave again, there's a proc. And Overpower has kind of taken a back seat as long as Sweeping Strikes is active for Mortal Strike, because we want to get those 2 Mortal Strikes to help reset or Demolish faster, because you get 1 stack per Mortal Strike cast, 2 if you got Sweep Up, and if they both crit, you get 4, because you get double for crits. That's why it's taking priority even over Overpower, and you basically are never going to slam unless you have literally nothing else to press. And then Execute also is going to take priority over these 2 in a cleave situation there. So, unfortunately, this video is going on so long I kind of messed up that opener there. So I'm going to wait just 30 seconds here and we can try that again. And I also forgot my collateral damage buff there to pay attention to at the end of that. But while we're waiting, quickly, with this spec, in a single target, say you're just hitting a boss, it's going to be very similar to Slayer, except you're ignoring the opportunist, rule of thumb. But basically, you're going to charge in, put up your rend, roar, and then Ravager into your Avatar Warbreaker cooldowns, spamming Mortal Strike on cooldown, filling with overpowers, and last but not least, Slam. And anytime Mortal Strike resets, either from Exhilarating Blows or Battle Lord, we're going to go ahead and hit Mortal Strike as soon as you can. And then during the execute phase, it's going to be the same as Slayer. Get your 2 stacks of Executioner's Precision into a Mortal Strike, rinse, repeat, padding out just your rage with overpowers as you need to. And then during your Ravager window in execute phase, you can just press execute and overpower, because your Unhinged is going to auto-cast your Mortal Strikes during that, so you just have to worry about buffing those Mortal Strikes with Execute and Overpower. Alright, one last time on the AOE rotation here. I go in and Deep Wounds, Rend, Roar, Sweep, Ravager, Avatar, Warbreaker, Cleave, got a proc Cleave, another proc, you just keep procking, there's a Mortal Strike, another one, 10 stacks, Demolish. Big Cleave, Mortal Strikes. Their Cleave. Filling in with overpowers. Just rinse repeating this rotation here. Very smooth. Spending as much rage as we can. Make sure that we keep up our rend on everything. So now we're faced with this dilemma where I got 20 stacks of collateral damage, and Warbreaker just came back. So if I delay just a little bit and I put up another sweep again, I can Warbreaker into a next Demolish into that great big Cleave at the end of that from collateral damage. And then you just rinse, repeat, anytime there's adds. You can throw Roar up on cooldown, basically, anytime it's AoE, and just keep going like that. And yeah, that's pretty much what it's going to look like from the Colossus AoE point of view. This has been really long. I probably forgot something. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. If this helped in any way, feel free to give me a like if you would. Consider subscribing. I'm probably forgetting something. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.